5 cents might not seem like much, but when it's 5 cents for every cow every day, then it really adds up. New AminoSure XM precision-release methionine provides the optimal combination of cost, feed stability, rumen stability, and intestinal release to deliver the best cost per unit of available methionine on the market today. Learn how at balchemanh.com/findyourx.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Sorrell, Director of Global Marketing for Balchem Corporation, and I'll be your moderator today. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the next installment of Balchem's Real Science Lecture Series. Today's Real Science webinar is titled 3 Strategies to Implement Today That Will Increase Milk Protein and Producer Profits, with Dr. Mike Van Amburgh from Cornell University. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items to help you participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of the attendee interface, and you should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You're listening in using the computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. Please reach out to us via the chat box if you are experiencing any difficulties with your audio or connectivity, and we can give you more specific instructions on how to troubleshoot the problems. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to Dr. Van Amburgh by typing your questions into the questions pane on the control panel. You may send your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. If we do not answer your question today, we'll send a follow-up email to today's attendees with answers to all the questions submitted during the webinar. There are several handouts available during today's session, including a copy of the slides and a participation certificate to claim your ARPA CEU credits. Both are available in the Handouts tab on the control panel. These resources will also be available following the webinar at balchemanh.com/real science. For a second appearance on the Real Science Lecture Series, I would now like to welcome back Dr. Mike Van Amburgh. Mike currently leads the development of the Cornell Net Carbohydrate and Protein System, or perhaps better known as the CNCPS. The CNCPS is a nutritional evaluation and formulation model used worldwide, and through the efforts is focused on enhancing the efficiency of nutrient use by ruminants to improve the environmental impact of animal food production. A significant focus of his current work is to understand whole animal and ruminal nitrogen metabolism and amino acid supply and requirements to enhance the development of the CNCPS. Dr. Van Amburgh, the floor is now yours.
Hey, Scott, thank you very much. Good morning, afternoon, everybody, wherever you may be. So this title was given to me by Scott, and we laughed about it because I couldn't think of just 3 things that you might want to do to increase milk protein, which is why I put a question mark in it. But that's okay. So we're just gonna go ahead and go. And once I can figure out how to make her happen here. There we go. So things about today's discussion. Well, milk protein's at an all-time high. So how do we increase that or capture that income opportunity, right? Everybody can be angry about PPDs, but when you got milk protein at 5 something, we need to be focused on it. I'm going to talk about fermentable carbohydrates, forage versus byproducts, and dry matter intake. We're going to talk a little bit about Dcad, a little bit about fatty acids, and obviously we're going to come back to rumen protected amino acids, and we'll be done and open for questions. So thanks to Clay for giving me or sharing these slides with me. He's been updating some of the things that are going on, and the other day, we hit an all-time record high for milk protein at 562, right? 563 if you round up. That's amazing, right? It also reflects our current COVID condition where, milk protein, cheese, things like that are selling reasonably well. Milk volume and lactose is not so good. And our distribution of how that happens is not working as well as we would normally have it, milk that is, which is why our PPDs have been so negative here lately. But the opportunity here is, how do we start moving cows in a direction of capturing more protein yield so we can capture the value, the current market price of that protein. Right, and if we look at the Northeast, Federal Milk Marketing Order 1, and look at fat and protein, and there's 10 years, so not quite 10 years worth of data here. It's really interesting, you know, and we can see this where there's this this dip here, July, August, and then it rises back up later in the year, and we can see the same thing for protein, where, you know, January we're in that 3.15 or 3.1 to 3.15 range. We dip down around 3, and then back up as winter comes back on. You know, and it doesn't really matter where we look, right? We can look at just milk true protein, and we can see that, you know, 313 to 297 back up to 318, 316. And in that dip, you know, the question comes, why is that? Well, we could say heat stress, and it's probably also, if you think about it over time, it's pretty consistent, most likely related to some of the heat stress, change in temperature, change in lighting, things that impact how the cow partitions nutrients. If you go back to some of the work that Baumgart and Rhodes have done trying to describe insulin sensitivities and how cows shift their insulin sensitivity to prefer or metabolize glucose instead of fat, well, that's going to impact what that looks like. And that, I think this is all part of that regulation, right? But there probably are some things we can do to overcome this problem. And you can see the same thing in the upper Midwest. It doesn't really matter where you look. And I thought when Clay shared these slides with me, I got a big chuckle out of it, because I was doing similar types of things in Italy 10 years, more than 10 years ago. And you can see the same kind of response. There's milk fat from January through December, and you can see the significant drop that they see there. And milk protein and casein does the same thing, right? So this is a long-term observation. Most likely has a lot to do, again, with temperature and changes in insulin sensitivity. It suggests that if we're going to change milk protein in this time of year, and as we move into the fall, we need to get more propionate. We need to get more glucose, more gluconogenic precursors into the cow. And we need to figure out how to change dry matter intake. And there's a couple other things that I'm going to talk about, back to Dcad, fatty acid profiles, and things like that. And in the end, it's really, you know, it all starts with the cow. She's the one that arbitrates everything that we do. She's our judge and jury, you know, so if we make her happy, whatever that means to everybody, if we make her happy, then hopefully she'll make us happy, right? And there's always really simple things, right? And you know, this sounds really funny to say this, but hey, can we cool them? Got fans, got sprinklers. Can we do anything to reduce heat stress? How do we increase cow comfort? I think the key to that whole thing, because if we can do that, that's just promoting dry matter intake and lying time. You know, and I've been doing some work with a few groups here the last 6 to 8 months, focused on some technologies out there, and the technologies are awesome. But what we're finding is between, and I put the feed availability up here because I've been surprised how many times when we've walked the herd at midnight to 3 in the morning, those cows are out of feed, right? So I know that sounds really oversimplified, but I've been more surprised than not at the number of farms that are running out of feed 10, 11 o'clock at night, not seeing fresh feed until 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. And I don't care what technology you use or what your objectives are. I know those are really simple things, but it's been more prevalent here lately than I would have expected. So, you know, make sure there is feed availability 21 to 22 hours a day at least. And then we have to work towards at least 12 hours of line time per day, right? And some of that comes back to overcrowding. In the Northeast, we like to make use of our barns. We want to keep as many cows in there to dilute out that fixed cost. But sometimes, you know, the COVID thing taught us that maybe that's not so good. because we started to cull a bunch of cows and milk protein component yield went up, right? And we were shipping as much milk with less cows as we would more. And again, that directly reflects on margin. But this has been, I think this is a key part of this whole discussion about how do I capture more value and how do I increase my margin? And how do I pick up more protein? Well, cows that can lie down and get plenty of feed all the time are generally going to be our higher yielding cows, right? It all seems really obvious, but we seem conflicted about that at times. All right, really simple things. Again, some of this is going to come back to amino acid balancing, but I always start here because this has been, again, this has been things that sometimes surprise me. Do we have current feed chemistry and do we understand any of digestibility? You'll understand the implications of that here in just a couple minutes. Have we characterized the cows appropriately? I'm gonna come back to that with a couple slides, but I still see a bunch of people who are feeding cows that don't exist, right? Or cows that aren't in the herd. I still see people with, 1,350 pound cows in their software when I don't know of any cow other than maybe a big Jersey that weighs 1,350. It sure as heck isn't a Holstein. Do you understand dry matter intake, and do we have actual milk lining up with ME and MP allowable milk? Again, really simple things. Are we just paying attention to which way the cows are going, up, down? We don't have body weights. That's a real problem sometimes because sometimes energy efficiency is better than we think it is, and we're only looking at milk. And then again, in the end, do we know what's first limiting, right? Is it feed? Is it lying time? Are there limiting amino acids? Do we just not have enough energy, right? What is it? Here's things that drive me crazy. I was going to change the title of this, and in the interest of time, I didn't get it done. I see a lot of cows that weigh 1,650 to 1,800, but we're using 1,350 to 1,450 to formulate. And we're not using the actual dry matter intakes, and we're using feed library values. And that makes it really hard to get everything to coalesce. So when we were talking about balancing for grams of things, if we're 200 or 300 pounds off on body weight, it makes it hard to get to a gram level and be really precise about it. And this is a bit of a problem. You can see that here. Here's a diet where the cows are at 1580, about 1,600 pounds, a mature size of just over 1,750. And you can see that the diet says, yeah, we're actually just a little bit deficient on MP, but that 38 gram deficiency on MP, although that looks really subtle, what that tells me is that there's an opportunity to bring in some amino acids, right? And that we could balance that just a little bit more effectively with amino acids. Maybe methionine is going to be deficient, and that would help us understand, or that would help us give us the opportunity for more milk protein. If that cow is modeled at 1,350, which is something I'm still seeing a lot of, you don't see those deficiencies, right? You're not modeling the same cow. You don't understand that she may be a few grams short on methionine or lysine at that point. So again, you lose the opportunity because she just doesn't model out the same way, and you're missing the opportunity to actually refine the diet. Okay. So let's get right into the protein thing. This is an old slide, but this was really one of the first reports to say, hey, you know what? Milk protein percentage and dietary energy are really closely aligned with each other, right? And then we get into the whole concept of sugars and starches and digestible fiber and microbial yield and propionate and things like that. And then in 2007, Gerald Lobley wrote a really interesting paper about horizontal interactions. And he made a point here that I think is really important. He said, although we consider protein and energy metabolism as separate, we realize that's not real, it's artificial. So we need to consider them together. I'm going to come back to this right at the very end. So we got to realize that energy and protein go together here. So if we want more milk protein, the real important thing is we got to get more energy into the cows, right? But sometimes that's really hard, right? We can't change that tomorrow. So we're going to talk about things that maybe we can change tomorrow, this is a longer term change, to say, okay, I'm going to get more ME intake into them. How do I get more ME intake into them and drive that protein synthesis through insulin and propionate, right? Because it's important to remember that milk protein is an energy-driven event. It relies on the adequate supply of amino acids, but it's really driven by propionate production in the rumen. You know, that converts to glucose, that stimulates insulin, and the whole thing just cascades, right? And you know, there's IGF-1 in there too, and it's also important to realize that as energy goes up, the first promoter for milk protein synthesis, or the first promoter for IGF-1 secretion is energy, but the second promoter is protein. So after energy is met and IGF-1 is being regulated based on homeoretic signaling, well, then protein will actually help. Amino acids will enhance that response. And, you know, and then we get into the whole thing related to mTOR, which we're not going to talk about that today other than that time I mentioned it, right? But you can see that here real quick. These are calves. It's the cleanest data that we have. You got 2 levels of intake. The red line is plasma IGF. They're all consuming the same amount of energy. And you can see that from 14 to 26% crude protein on the high energy calves, the higher intake calves, that IGF-1 is higher than the lower intake, circulating IGF-1 is, but then as you titrate in more protein, it increases. So the liver's recognizing those amino acids and saying, hey, you can make more protein. I'm going to give you the signaling process to make more protein because you've got the building blocks here, right? The same thing happens in the dairy cow. It's much more sophisticated, and we have a hard time making these very simple manipulations in a lactating cow, but we know the same mechanism is in play, right? And we know through lots of older data that as we increase insulin and glucose with or without protein, we can increase protein synthesis, right? And I think we want to increase, if we really want to increase, you know, milk protein synthesis and increase our milk protein output, we have to increase our microbial yield, right? And when we look at this, this is an old slide. We all kind of know this. This is what we're trying to do. We're primarily trying to feed the rumen. We have to think about, all right, where are our protein sources for those bugs? We gotta make sure the rumen nitrogen balance is acceptable. I added some things to this. You can see here, I've got this endogenous protein on here now. Back in the day, when Russell and Sniffen and Nozick and all those guys were doing this, they didn't understand the context of endogenous protein beyond a maintenance requirement. And now we know that bacteria will use, and protozoa to that degree, will use as much endogenous protein as they use recycled urea. So it's a very important component of microbial growth. But then we got to make sure we've got plenty of carbohydrates, right? So now we get into how many carbohydrates do we have, how fermentable are they in the rumen, and how do we ensure that they're there, right, in the form that the bugs are going to make best use of. I pulled this slide out of something, I pulled this data out of something that Charlie Sniffen and a couple other guys had put together many, many years ago now. Modified it just a little bit, but I think it's important that we think about this when we're trying to increase milk protein yield, because we're trying to increase milk or microbial protein yield, right? So when we look at early peak and mid lactation cows, you know, how much fermentable non-structural carbohydrate do we want, or how much fermentable carbohydrate do we want? You know, and we're in that 40 to 43% of dry matter range. And then we think about, well, what's from the starch, right? Well, you know, early cows, and this is fermentable starch, right? So we're talking about how much actually ferments in the rumen, and you say 18.5 to 20, well, you're really talking about ranges of like 82 to 92% fermented in the rumen. One of the other reasons I wanted to bring this up, because whenever we're trying to do amino acid studies, we're always trying to run our sugars as high as we can. And maybe not push, one of the things that we've started to do is maybe not push our starch up so much and bring in some more fermentable sugar. A lot of the sugar will go to butyrate and not as much propionate. And I know that seems counterintuitive, but it's also part of if we go back to the hot theory, we're also trying to regulate around the hepatic oxidation theory. So we want some propionate, but we want some microbial yield. And one of the things we know the sugar does very effectively is produce bacteria and protozoa. And I think that's the other thing to bring up here. In all of our current field models, we don't have protozoa in those field-based models, but protozoa can be 20% of the microbial yield. All right, so it's a very important source of protein for these cows. And as we kick up the sugar, we're going to see more protozoa being generated. That's not so much a negative. It's not as much of a negative, I think, as we used to think it was 20, 25 years ago or better. And then you get into the soluble fiber, and that gets you into the 5 to 6% range at least. Could be higher than that if you're feeding a bunch of beet pulp, citrus pulp, almond hulls, and things like that. And the western U.S. and the southern part of the country has that capability much more than we do in the Northeast. So for high cows, we're looking at 86 to 90% ruminal starch digestion. Might like it a little bit higher than that, but it doesn't have to be that high. And again, I go back to some stuff that Will Hoover did years and years and years ago now. Everybody's forgotten about Will Hoover except for some of us old farts. I guess I'm getting to be one of those guys. But Hoover had data, very clear data that showed, hey, you get, even with our TMRs, with our starch, we get in that 5 to 7% range on sugar. We see improved microbial yield. We also see improved fiber digestion. And I've used that quite a bit. When I see NDF that is pretty slow to digest, and I see things that are I see diets that look a little sluggish, a little bit of sugar goes a long way. And we don't always know why it is. Yeah, we're going to get some more butyrate, definitely going to get some more microbes, but we also know that the protozoa are pretty good at digesting fiber, but the protozoa might need some quick energy to grow and reproduce and do things like that. They're a little chemotactic, right? They're not just omnivores out there eating everything, although they kind of behave that way sometimes. So you get them a little sugar, you make them happy, and they go out and they eat some more fiber. But we see increases in fiber digestibility and microbial yield. And in a 40-minute talk like this, there's no time to go back through that data. But Hoover's old data was actually pretty clear cut on that. And so I think if we're trying to get more microbial protein, trying to get more milk protein synthesis, pushing the sugar up a little higher than a lot of people generally do. I see a lot of diets 3 to 4% at best, right? So in many cases, we're actually going to double the sugar content, still not that high. And anybody who we get into the situation where somebody says, well, I don't know how high in sugar I can go. This is an Irish pasture grass. We've been doing some research over in Ireland. And you can see here the water-soluble carbohydrates in those high-quality pasture grasses are running about 24%. Right? They don't have a lot of starch. They sure have a lot of sugar. And I can tell you we sure get a lot of protozoa out of those. But again, that's their energy source. And remember, it doesn't really go to lactic acid, so the chance of true ruminal acidosis, the way we used to think about it, just isn't there, right? There's just not much starch in those diets, but a lot of water-soluble carbohydrates, including the fructans in there. So there's no problem feeding sugars to cows. It's just, can we afford to do it, and where should we be? Which is why I'm thinking if we can get that to 5 to 7 right now, I think we should see a nice increase in microbial yield, a little more energy, faster energy, and generally we see a push towards a little bit more milk protein, okay? And you can see that here, because what we know is we do things to drive de novo fatty acid synthesis. In other words, plenty of acetate, plenty of propionate, good fermentations, and plenty of microbial yield. This is data from Dave Barbano. As we get more de novo fatty acid synthesis, we see more protein output, right? And we know because those two processes are kind of intimately linked. As we get more lactose, we generally get more milk protein. And the more de novo, not the preform, but the more de novo means the gland is working better, synthesizing its own fatty acids, will also synthesize more milk protein, but that's dependent on having a good balance of nutrients. So we're looking at propionate, we're looking at amino acids coming from microbial protein, we're looking at good NDF digestibility, all those things coming together to push this response or encourage this response, okay? So again, just driving towards how do we get a little bit more microbial yield. One way to do that here is just get some sugar in that diet. That's one way to do it. Obviously, we could make our starch more digestible, and we can come back to that. But I'm not sure, a lot of people are pushing starch as it is or what's available. A lot of people process really well. If you're using steam flake corn, then I don't know what else we're going to do to improve that. You could crank it up a little bit more, but I would rather see a little more sugar go in there than that, doing that. So in a lot of the country right now, based on the weather last fall and the rain, a lot of people don't have a lot of forage. Yes, we've been chopping, but again, in the Northeast, we've been short on rain. Corn silage is coming along. We still have some corn silage from last fall. May not be the best stuff. Our haylage has not been high yielding because we've had a lot of rain deficits in the upper Midwest. We had a lot of floods last year. And so one of the things I want to talk about here is how do we enhance intake? And instead of talking about starch, I was going to turn it around and talk about, well, what are some other things we could bring into the diet that might enhance microbial yield, really enhance intake. Again, it's obvious that energy is going to drive milk protein synthesis, and it's really hard to change, but maybe we can make subtle manipulations of the diet to increase some intake. All right, because we've got, you know, we're a little scarce on forages. Maybe we don't have high digestibility forages, or if we do, we don't have a big inventory of them. How do we do this? So we ran a study a few years ago. This is just getting ready to be sent to the journal, where we looked at high and low fiber or forage. We were looking at our NDF pools. So the next few slides are going to look really complex. I'll distill them down. But you know, 144 cows, 9 pens, 16 animals, 3x3 Latin square, 21 days, 5-day sampling period, right? And what we were doing is high UNDF diet, a low UNDF diet, and then basically a non-forage diet. So 66% of the ANDFOM came from non-forages. And part of this, you know, grew out of our interest in the pools, but also some of our colleagues down in Florida and the Southeast would tell me, you know, Mike, I don't have a lot of forages, so it's not uncommon for me to run 30% forage diets, but I do okay. Why is that? Or how do we do that? Or how can I make it better? Right? So this is all playing on some of those conversations, but also just based on the science of understanding, you know, what some of this would look like as we start to play with some of these NDF pools. All right, so we had, you know, alfalfas, we had BMR corn silage, we had conventional corn silage, you know, so we can see the conventional corn silage in the high UNDF diet, BMR in the low UNDF diet with a low UNDF alfalfa. But what's most important here, so we've got these 70% forage diets here on the left, and then on the very right column, the high UNDF non-forage diet. And you can see a little bit of the alfalfa, a little bit of the corn silage, and then a whole lot of byproducts, right? Citrus, corn gluten, corn grain, cottonseed, soy hulls, soy plus, sunflower seed hulls. Those were fun to get here. That's not common anywhere in the Northeast. Wheat nids, vitamins and minerals, right? So when we look at these diets, we see crude protein right around 16, ANDF, you know, we tried to be right around 33% ANDFOM. We're going to skip the pools for now. this is really just about intakes and about how do we make adjustments to diets, because I don't think anybody's going to move all the way to a 30% forage diet unless they absolutely have to. But what it might mean right now is if I can make a deal on a byproduct that gets me better digestibility than some of my forages, changes my intake a little bit, I can pick up on some of this milk protein and get a little bit more margin out of it, right? Starch running about 25%, nothing too dramatic there. Trying to be right around 6% sugar, and ether extract right around 4. And you can see lysine and methionine was fairly fixed on this one. We were targeting, you know, right around 96 to 100 pounds of milk on a protein basis, or on a ME and MP basis. Dry matter intake, right? Dry matter intake at 61 on the 2 high forage diets. Look what happened on that byproduct diet. We're pushing up to almost 71 pounds of dry matter intake, right? And those cows, you know, they filled up on AND-FOM, you know, 20 to 23. So we see about just over a 3 pound increase in AND-FOM. UNDF went up accordingly. And we don't need to get into all of this, just the idea that I think what's important about these diets where we're trying to make some manipulations to increase intake, get more protein, you just want to make sure you got enough NDF in there to keep everybody happy, right? Mostly the bugs and the cow. We don't want acidosis. But I think here's what's really important, right? We look at 91, 96, and about 106 pounds of milk. Energy corrected milk, you know, 94, 96.8, 100. The fat kind of went down, and again, we expected that a little bit. With the byproducts, we've got some more unsaturated fatty acids. But what I wanted you guys to see here is look at the true protein yield: 267, 2832, huge increase. You know, 0.6 of a pound increase in milk protein output on these cows, where we modified the diet, reduced the forages, brought in some highly digestible byproducts, made things a little more, you know, just increased our intake. And I know some of you are going to say, well, you really screwed up, and you can see the true protein percentage here, right? Went up nicely. And again, like all these, you got to protect against the milk fat. We had a little bit too much unsaturated fatty acids. And we couldn't control for that. That just came along with the byproducts, and that's something that I don't know what you do with. At least in this case, we didn't. But you look at the feed efficiency, right? And we're looking at energy-corrected milk to dry matter intake, and you say, well, geez, you lost efficiency. Well, we did lose a little bit of efficiency, but we picked up a fair amount of protein that today would be worth quite a bit of money. But I think one of the things that you have to keep in mind here is that we picked up some energy too, right? And I realize that this is probably not right. This is by period. These cows gained a lot of body weight, and you can see rumination was good, right? So I think there's two things here. Feed efficiency might not look good, but the cows realize the energy, because if you're doing this to early lactation or high producing cows, you're actually picking up body weight. They're not losing the energy. They're just partitioning it to some of it to body composition or body energy replenishment. And I think we miss that because we don't weigh cows, and we're not always condition scoring as frequently as maybe we should. But also just maintaining the NDF content of some of these byproduct diets will maintain chewing and rumination in an acceptable level. You know, we're above that 500 minute per cow per day threshold. But I think the most important thing here to me is the ability to drive intake a little bit right now and pick up some microbial yield and get a little bit more of that milk protein that's so valuable. So that's where you have to do, you know, if you're contracted on a bunch of byproducts, great. If you're not, maybe there's some room here to make some manipulations, right? And I want to talk about that because I think that's a different way of doing it. We're not going high starch. We're saying, hey, what can I bring in here that can pick up a little bit of intake, maybe overcome some of my not so good forages, give me a little bit more uniformity of intake. I remember a few years ago when we had the drought in the Midwest and a lot of herds moved this direction, they actually saw their components go up and their milk go up as they dropped their forage amount because the byproducts they purchased were actually really uniform and higher digestibility than their forages. Okay. So Dcad, right? We talk about this. There's been a lot of work done on potassium. Potassium is really expensive to get in the diet. You know, it's great if you've got it coming in the forage through the manure, through the manure allocation. That's even better. But when we look at some of these studies that have been done, again, the top 3 things you can do. What can you do tomorrow? Well, we could increase the Dcad. All right, and again, I don't think about this every day because I'm always focused on amino acids. But when you start to look at these studies, you know, in this particular review the study by Hugh, they see a 4% increase in milk protein with a higher Dcad independent of the crude protein level. And again, that's a busy slide, so I'm not going to focus on that. But it looks like, you know, again, we're not going to do a full review of this, but the other thing they observed is that as they increase the Dcad, right, and moving towards, you know, above 350, above 35, that they see a nice increase in intake, right? And people have been working on why is that? Well, it looks like fiber digestibility is enhanced. So whether there's potassium requirement or a buffering capacity, I don't see anybody with a real answer on this yet. But I've seen lots of data that said, well, maybe the fiber bugs need a little bit more potassium. Maybe we're just buffering the rumen better. Maybe in certain conditions, we're buffering the cow a little bit better, right? Especially right now when it's hot outside, it's going to be 90 in upstate New York again today. Cows probably need a little bit more potassium anyhow. But, you know, it looks like, you know, Dcad is a really effective way of improving milk protein output primarily through enhanced digestibility. In this particular study, 11% increase. Again, they did 2 levels of protein and 2 Dcad levels independent of the protein, 11% increase in milk protein, and actually a 26% increase in milk fat, and a 26% increase, almost a 20% increase in lactose too, right, which isn't in here. So again, Dcad looks like a fairly simple way. If you're not currently doing that, maybe get your Dcad cranked up, get it to 350 or a little bit higher, 35, whatever number you want to use, using the original equation, Dcad 1. And that looks like it does a nice job. If you review enough of the literature, it's pretty clear cut for the most part on increasing milk protein. I think there's a few studies where they don't see increases in milk protein output, and I've read those studies a few times now, and I think that some of those studies that don't see a response are probably amino acid limiting. I know I'm saying this independent of the protein. I think there's some other things. There are some levels where if we get into a limiting amino acid situation, we're gonna miss it. Other things you could do tomorrow, and I got a bunch of these questions after I did the first Balchem webinar on amino acids. I got hit up with a bunch of questions and a bunch of emails about why we're not looking at fatty acids and insulin responses in milk protein. So I wrote my colleague Joe McFadden. Geez, oh, Pete's too many McFaddens. Joe McFadden, I walked across the hallway and said, tell me everything you know about this. So he sent me a bunch of papers, and I read everything that Adam Locke has put out lately. And this fits with some things that I've been wondering about, because for years we just fed fat, but these guys are starting to get to the point where they're saying, hey, maybe there's a requirement, maybe there's a profile that makes cows more energetically efficient. And as we get to that profile that looks more energetically efficient, we're seeing improvements in insulin signaling, right? So I pulled some of that apart here. I've got one paper. In the interest of time, I got one paper that looks at this, but there's 3 or 4 papers out there now that all point in the same direction, that as we get this profile of fatty acids correct, the cow's saying, hey, that's a good thing. I'm going to help you guys out by changing my insulin signaling or my sensitivity. I have not looked at IGF-1 yet. So if we look at this paper by D'Souza, published in 2019, they looked at the ratio of C16 to, basically palmitic to oleic on productivity. And they're looking simply at the fatty acid blends. I think we should probably be looking at this on a dietary basis, right? And you can see the ranges there, 80 to 10, 73, 17, 66, and then 60, 30. So like a 1.5 to 1. You're going to hear me come back to that. And again, happy to share. The slides will be shared with you. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving. But when we look at that, on a percent dry matter, the 16.0, 158, 144, 133, 126, so dropping a little bit. And as the C16.0, as the palmitic drops, the oleic increases 0.68, 0.78, 0.88, 0.98, right? And whether this is digestibility or just fatty acid profile in general for metabolism, I'm not sure we really know that yet. But what's most important is when we start to look at what are those cows doing with lactose and protein. And we see these nice, even though this isn't significant here on the treatment, and I recognize that, if you look at this data and you get that ratio about 1.5 to 1 on palmitic to oleic, we see about a 5 to 6% increase in milk protein yield that we didn't see before. And actually, we see about a 7% increase in lactose in these cows at that same ratio, right? So what this suggests to me is that the gland is moving in concert. It's picking up efficiency. We've got some signaling going on, right? Because we're seeing both protein and lactose move in the same direction. These cows might be a little bit amino acid limiting. Anyhow, things you could do tomorrow. Almost everybody's feeding fat, right? I don't know of too many diets that don't have some form of fat in it. What this would suggest is maybe as we feed fat, we alter these ratios a little bit, try to get to that 1.5 to 1 range and pick up the opportunity to get a little bit more milk component yield, all right? Because it's so valuable right now. Again, coming back to the $5.62 a pound for milk protein. Okay. One more thing, I always say this, pay attention to digestibility. This is a slide from Paul Koninoff's lab that he graciously shared with me. This just happens to be feather meal. And he and I were comparing notes one day, and he actually ran, mobile bag. He had this run in a commercial lab with a Ross assay, and you can see that, there was pretty good agreement between the two methods on digestibility. That's not the point here. The point here is that notice that there's a range in digestibility of these sources, this particular source of feather meal running from 49 to almost 80% digestible. I see blood meal, I see distillers, I see a bunch of other ingredients that behave the same way. So if we're going to balance for amino acids, we have to make sure that we're understanding digestibility. And we know from previous studies where we've tested this, that the cows will in fact respond to high and low digestibility. They will be protein limited. They will respond that way. And a lot of times that happens and we don't have this information, and it drives all of us crazy because we really don't know what's going on. All right, so you can't go out and be cheap, right? If milk protein's running $5.62 a pound, do some math, figure out, okay, what can I afford? Go find some better protein. And what I've learned is you kind of get what you pay for. At least in the stuff that we've analyzed for many years now, there's some really great products out there. Pay a little bit more for that consistency and performance. There are some that you can buy really cheap, and there's a reason for it. All right, so just make sure you're paying attention. Don't go too cheap trying to do this, because the cows will respond with more milk protein if you get this right, right? So we'll just finish up here talking about balancing for amino acids. If we just look at the broken stick model, on milk protein yield and CNCPS. We're at about 2.6%, so I'm taking kind of an NRC approach here. We're at about 2.6% digestible methionine as a percent of the MP to optimize milk protein yield using CNCPS 6.5. On lysine, we're at about 7. Digestible lysine at about 7% of the metabolizable protein, right? And these numbers have been out there for a while. But in the interest, in the interest of moving ahead, we developed, moving towards version 7, actual numbers, grams, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 5th column, grams of amino acid per mcal of ME, right? And we're working to get version 7 out into everybody's hands. We've done enough studies now, we're comfortable with its predictions, and we've fixed some of the offsets, so hang on, we're getting there. But I'd like to see it gone. But, we were at 1.14 on methionine, 1.14 grams of amino acid per mcal of ME, and 3.03 for lysine, right? And kind of the traditional numbers you would see as a percent of the essential amino acids. Well, we ran a study, there's a few more slides here. We ran a study looking at those numbers on 144 cows, and what we tested was the range in the data, right? So we came up with those optimums, but there's a standard deviation around the methionine, and there's a standard deviation around the lysine, and there's a standard deviation around the rest of the essential amino acids. So we ran a study evaluating this to try to find out, well, if we go down 1 standard deviation for all essential amino acids from our optimum, or up 1 standard deviation, will the cows tell us anything different than some of our initial studies, right? So we're just boundary testing. So again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Heavy corn silage, high moisture corn, some triticale, and then a bunch of other ingredients to round out our carbohydrates and our proteins. Some maroon protected methionine, some maroon protected lysine, some blood meal, energy booster. Notice down there, second from the bottom, we've got dextrose. Again, we like sugar. We tend to see better responses to milk protein yield when we've got some sugar in the diet. And we're doing that now instead of pushing the starch all the way up. So when we look at the crude protein, 14, 14, 7, and 16, right? So that just reflects the amino acid balance. NDFs are running 31, 32. Sugar's not quite as high. We were pushing for that at least 5 range. We didn't quite make it. We're running right around 4 there. So we should have added just a little bit more. And we were expecting the starch to be just a little bit lower in the end, but that's just how it turns out. And that's what happens with corn silage. Okay. And there's our grams of amino acids. So you can see on things like methionine, 71, 78, 92, lysine, 201, 222, 250. So these are the actual grams fed every day in the study. So we've got a really nice titration there. And the cows basically said, if you go low, we don't like it. And we're not going to produce as much energy corrected milk, and we're not going to make as much protein. But our optimums, what we call the neutral here, they did fine. True protein yield was good, not statistically different from the positive. So even when we went way up, we didn't see big responses there. The true protein content actually was the same, right? So this gave us the fat was the same. So it gave us a lot of comfort that those numbers are pretty good. Where am I going with this? Well, where I'm going with this, just to end up, is that after we ran that study, we put everything back through version 6.5.5. And the optimum methionine level turned out to be 1.19 grams of methionine per mcal of Me. That's a little higher than version 7, and that just reflects the differences between having protozoa and endogenous protein in the model, which we don't have in 6.5. In both versions, you need to maintain a lysine to methionine ratio of 2.7 to 1, okay? But I know, and I'm showing you guys this because I think if you're gonna push for more milk protein, we have to push our methionine and lysine levels a little bit. And I know some nutritionists have pushed back on me saying, Mike, that's just really damn high. And I said, yeah, I know it is, but this is what the cows tell us they need, right? So if the cow's consuming 60 mcals of Me, you multiply that by 1.19, you come up with a requirement for 71 grams of methionine at the small intestine. And we know that the relationship between methionine and lysine is 2.7. So you multiply that out by 2.7. So we need 193 grams of lysine. And that freaks people out even more, right? Simply because we don't tend to run lysine that high in a lot of diets. But again, this is what the cows are telling us their requirements are. And I think when people say, gee, I've amino acid balance in the past and I just never made it work, I think it's because we're just not close to the requirements, right? We might be doing better, but we might not be in the, or we might not be in the right relationship, right? We got our methionine up there, but because of digestibility and sources, we didn't get our lysine up there. So always calculate methionine first, and then move on with your lysine. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Mike. Before we get started answering questions, we'd like to share a brief video, and then we'll be right back to answer questions submitted during today's presentation. And we may, oh, there you go.
With today's low milk prices and rising feed protein costs, now is the time to turn up the dial on rumen efficiency. NitroSure precision-release nitrogen is designed to help stabilize rumen ammonia pools by synchronizing carbohydrate and nitrogen availability to the microflora. Providing a consistent supply of ammonia is proven to increase rumen microbial populations, improve fiber and dry matter digestibility, and stimulate microbial protein yield, all leading to greater efficiencies in forage utilization and higher milk and milk component production. Maximize rumen microflora with NitroSure to turn up rumen efficiency and productivity.
As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane on the attendee control panel. Dr. Van Amburgh, our first question, actually we got two that's somewhat related from Todd and Daryl. One is asking, Mike, are all sugars the same? What specific types of sugars should we be feeding? And the other is, do we treat lactose the same as sucrose?
Great question. No, they're not really all the same. Sucrose and fructose would be at the top of my list. Dextrose, I love dextrose, but it's really expensive, you know, because you just know what you're getting. Lactose, Jeff Firkins did a nice, he never published it. I got to see it a couple times privately, sort of. He did a nice review of lactose in cows, and they respond very well to lactose, but it's a really slow degrading sugar in the rumen. They'll adapt to it and they'll get up and running. So it is a functional sugar, but I think you're going to get more bang for your buck out of sucrose, fructose, and dextrose and things like that. We could get into the rest of the sugars, but those are the ones we tend to see the most. You know, and there's, you know, over time, sniffing has pushed my buttons about 5 carbon sugars versus 6 carbon sugars. And I think there probably are some differences in the rumen, but, you know, what we call water soluble carbohydrates in most forages, you know, I go back to the you know, the fructans and things like that. Those things really drive protozoal growth and microbial growth. So I think that's what we've got to focus on. But anyhow, not all created equal, but sucrose, fructose, dextrose, things like that.
All right. We're going to stay with the sugar theme here. Could the sugar effect on increasing fiber digestion that Hoover reported be mediated by anaerobic fungi as well as bacteria and protozoa? Not all anaerobic fungi can use starch.
That's true, and I'm gonna feign ignorance here. I have tried to learn about fungi, but I haven't tried a lot because I've been so focused on getting the protozoa figured out for the modeling purposes. So I can't give you good answers. 10 years ago, we ran a study trying to manipulate the fungi and get some outcomes, and we just were really unsuccessful, and I never went back to it. right? That's when I started on the protozoal thing. So I don't have a good answer for you. I wish I did. If anybody out there is listening and has any good answers about the fungi, I'm all ears.
All right, very well. We'll stay with sugars. James is asking, in CNCPS, sugar KD were reduced approximately 40% per hour from original versions and assigned to liquid passage rate, so ruminal digestibility of sugar can be less than a fast starch. So does the model predict the bump in microbial protein synthesis with added sugar you mentioned?
It does, and that's a great observation. That's one of the fixes in the model. The next feed library will have a fix in it because 40 is too low. It'll be 60. How's that? Probably not entirely satisfactory, but yeah, well, we dropped it from 2 to 300, which I think in vitro you can measure some things like that, and there's some other data out there. You know, there's some data out there where it's even faster, but I think that's somewhat analytical error because I've tried to go back and recreate some of that, and we can't do it. But I don't think anything disappears at 300% per hour initially, because I think, again, we're trying to replicate. It depends on what form we're feeding the sugar in. But I think in that 60 range, we're going to probably hit just about everything, and we'll try to detail that over time. But yes, it needs to be a little bit higher. So I agree with whoever asked the question that 40 is too low.
All right. Ran is asking, protozoa are specifically retained in the rumen, basically engulfing bacteria and increasing recycling. What are your thoughts in regards? Is this the right way to increase microbial yield and MP?
Great question. Just finished a very long PhD dissertation trying to get an answer to that. What we learned is they're not preferentially retained in the rumen. Our new characterization of protozoal flow, this is all for version 7, and it lines up with all the other literature data that are out there because we ran it against every omasal flow study we could find that had good data. The protozoa flow about 80% with the liquid and 20% with the solid passage. So they actually aren't preferentially retained. And we learned that by dosing protozoa or bacteria, just dosing the rumen with a bunch of stable isotopes, measuring the concentration in the rumen, measuring the concentration at the omasal orifice, getting the flows. And what we found is that they do flow primarily more with the liquid passage, and that does fit some older literature, but there's not been a lot of work done on that. Nobody's actually dosed the protozoa in the rumen and then measured it and had the same marker and had the right marker. So we're feeling pretty comfortable about this because it actually, like I said, fit all the other omasal flow data pretty well, and it cleaned up our bias in version 7 predictions.
All right. There's a lot of pushback on BMR corn, and producers are looking at other corn varieties. Since everything discussed today hinges on fiber digestibility, where do you stand on this, and what are your thoughts on the potential impact on milk protein production with this move? And that comes from William.
Hey, William. Yeah, and I don't take sides on the BMR conventional thing anymore. There are so many forages coming online and so many ways of thinking about forages. You know, I'm just starting to look for those highest digestibility varieties that you can find, BMR or otherwise, right? Everything's going to respond to light, heat, and water, whether you're a BMR or a conventional forage. You know, as we have more water scarcity, that's going to change digestibility. As we get more heat, a little bit of that's going to change digestibility. So I'm just looking at some of the data. I'm always looking on a regional basis, you know, because I can't trust if somebody grows the corn silage in Georgia versus New York. I'm not going to trust that data to replicate our system. Same, Wisconsin would be closer to New York. I think it's important that we just start looking at all the digestibility data we can. And my recommendation is, we're looking at that 3-pool system now, and we're saying, hey, we want the corn silage was the largest fast pool. And it's not just the corn silage. We want every forage we can get with a large fast pool, right? So the greater that first, that rapid rate of digestion, right? And some of the labs are now moving to 12 hours time points to capture some of this information. We're going to support that because our data says we probably have to have a 12-hour time point to capture these really good forages or more of the information. Yeah, the higher the digestibility in those early hours, the greater the intake potential, the greater the digestibility. And I think that's how we have to reorient our decision-making process. And if you go way, way back and you read Van Soest's book, he's got a graph in there from some data in the UK where the 12-hour digestibility of dry matter or organic matter had the highest correlation with dry matter intake. So I think we just have to get focused on digestibility and whatever forage is out there. And, and again, we don't want them too mature. I think the other thing we've got to worry about or be concerned about is I see too much tension yet. I know this is true because we just overgrew our dairy and don't have the land resources, but this tension between yield and digestibility is a big one. Because a few more points of yield, digestibility are really powerful, but sometimes we don't have the inventory to allow that.
Very well. Mike, I'm going to do a time check real quick here. It's at the top of the hour. We typically cut it off at the top of the hour, but we've gotten a lot of feedback from the audience that they enjoy the Q&A session. And so I'm willing to proceed a little bit longer if you've got the bandwidth for it and the time.
Sure.
Maybe 5-10 more minutes.
Whatever. Yep, I got 10 more. Yeah, 10 would be good.
All right, great. Our next question comes from Buzz. Could you comment on the amino acid requirements when the CP level of the diet is 14% to 15%?
Buzz, I need your context. The requirements are the same. I think the question is what's the supply? So as we pull the protein levels down, I think what he's really getting at is what becomes first limiting. So when you're in that 14 to 15% range on crude protein, depending upon your forages and however else you're putting your protein supply together, methionine and lysine are definitely pretty close to 1 and 2. I think we're looking more at histidine, although we haven't quite figured out how to put that in there yet. All right, it's a little expensive to bring histidine in with common feed sources. And then we get into the branched chains. So you got to pay attention to leucine as you start to pull your protein down. That's why blood meal, good quality blood meal or animal protein in general becomes your best friend as you get towards the lower limit of nitrogen intake. And that we could go back and look at that in Andrew Lapierre's study, is that it was hard to build those diets in a way where we could meet most of those amino acid requirements, but we weren't really trying to, we're just trying to test those boundaries. But you get into those scenarios where you start to worry about, gee, I wish I had a source of rumen protected histidine or leucine, even tryptophan, right? We've run some studies, or not studies, we've run some diets where we're a little suspect on some of those phenolic amino acids.
All right, one of our past guests, Dr. Mike Hutchins, is asking, you use ME versus NE. Why the difference in your ratios?
I use ME instead of NE. Yes, Dr. Hutchins. I use ME because I have spent a lot of time looking at how we manipulate milk composition based on season, based on dietary makeup, based on fatty acid profiles, and the NEs assume that fat is fat because we tend to use a static value for the energy concentration of fat, yet we know that as we go from short chain and de novo fatty acids to preformed and longer chain fatty acids, that the energy content of the fat changes, which to me makes it more difficult to actually use NE precisely. If I could figure out what fatty acid profile the cow was secreting or synthesizing, then it would probably be easier to use NE. So I am always referring to ME. And I know that's not a satisfactory answer to a lot of people, but when you're trying to model NE excretion, I find it really difficult because it does vary quite a bit based on that fatty acid profile.
And yet another question from a past guest lecturer. Dr. Chase is asking, are animal protein blends less variable than sources like blood meal for digestibility?
Good question, Larry. I miss having you around. Yeah, I think one way to, so my easy answer would be yes. Blending them up is always the lesser of all the evils because you're spreading out your risk. And that falls into all the work and all the talking and all the papers and all the calculations that Bill Weiss and Norman St. Pierre have done over the years, that you can't put all your eggs in one basket. So diluting out that risk of having something that just isn't the same one week to the next is important. So yes, blending is a better way to do that. But again, I would still say you still should do checks every once in a while to make sure that your blends are not being corrupted by a couple ingredients that just aren't what you think they are.
Very well. And Mike, we have a lot of questions, but we're going to ask just one more and would remind everyone that we will answer all of these questions in writing and we'll put them on our website. Dr. Van Amburgh, our last question is, you mentioned lysine-methionine ratios several times today. That seems like a move backwards to the way we feed cows with the NRC. How can we integrate this with some of the work showing more complex relationships between methionine, lysine, and other amino acids?
So I fully agree with you. I'm only talking about those two right now because in field, as it is right now, in a field applicable model, we don't have full capacity to model all essential amino acids. Now, it's a great question. It's one that frustrates me. My way around that has been, let's start, and that's why I showed you those few slides. You know, we have recommendations, not recommendations, we have actual numbers that we feel pretty good about now based on that study I showed you from Andrew Lapierre, where we're pretty comfortable, at least within the structure of version 7, that we can balance for all essential amino acids on a gram of digestible amino acid per mcal of ME basis. Right, so I agree with you, we've got to move away from just ratios. But what you should have observed in either the second last slide or the last slide, the second last slide, is that I gave you grams, right? So, you know, if the cow's eating 60 mcals, you need 71 grams of methionine at the small intestine, or if and that should lead to 193 grams of lysine. So I want to get this to grams. They require grams, not ratios. I'm just talking about the relationship between lysine and methionine. I use the term ratio, but there does seem to be that relationship, whether no matter which way we did the calculation, we always end up with that same relationship in terms of how many grams of lysine follow the methionine. But no, I want to get away from all that stuff. We're not going backwards. I want to get to grams.
All right. Thank you, Mike, and a lot of great questions. Just kind of want to give the folks still online here a tease, is that we're working on a podcast series called This Week in Dairy Science. Mike will be one of our first guest hosts, and we'll be talking on this very subject, and so we'll save a lot of these questions for that discussion. So with that, I want to thank Dr. Mike Van Amburgh, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. If you have additional questions, please submit them to anh.marketing@balchem.com, and we will forward them to you along with the unanswered questions from today's session. Please answer our short 3-question survey as you exit today's webinar. You will also receive a follow-up email within 48 hours with a link to a recording of today's webinar, and we'd appreciate it if you would share it with your colleagues. Links to past webinars are also available at balchemanh.com/real science. The next Real Science Lecture Series webinar from Balchem is scheduled for Tuesday, September 1st. Dr. Frank Mittenlohner, University of California, Davis, will speak on feeding the people without forfeiting the planet. Unlike our past webinars, this one will be relevant to all species, from ruminants to monogastrics, and yes, for even humans. So please forward a link to the webinar to anyone that has an interest in this subject matter. Please visit balchemanh.com/real science for more details. The registration link will be available as soon as possible. On behalf of Balchem and Dr. Mike Van Amburgh, thank you for joining us today.